So, I'm a little tired of the demonization of Donald Trump. I travel in liberal circles, so I cannot so much as log into Facebook or check my email without seeing it. It's ubiquitous. We have all seen these same memes, at least any of us that are on Facebook. Not my president, love Trump's hate, make America hate again, ban Trump, not immigrants, ban Trump, not Muslims, dump Trump, impeach Trump, Trump should deport Melania, she's an immigrant. There are ones that make fun of his orange hair, his orange complexion. I'm tired of seeing pictures of him on toilets, pictures of him in diapers, pictures of him as Hitler or Stalin or Kim Jong-un. I'm tired of all of it. I have several friends who make multiple anti-Trump posts every single day. And I've gotten so I look right past them. I don't like them, I don't comment on them, I don't share them, I don't really look at them. And when I'm at a social function and the conversation takes a Trump bashing turn, I try to change the subject to something else. So little of what anyone is saying in these conversations is meaningful or original or constructive. I am assuming that by now you already know that there's a catch coming, and that my reason for saying these things is not that I support this man or his policies or his statements. Like nearly everyone that I know, I find everything about his rhetoric abhorrent. I find his policies repugnant, and I find his record reprehensible. The reason I am tired of the bashing is because I truly believe that it misses the point. I don't see Donald Trump as the cause of all that is wrong with our nation. Instead, I see him as simply the worst symptom that we have seen so far of a country which has been on the wrong path for a very long time. The United States of America is, in many ways, a mean nation. It feels a little risky for me to say this, even here in an open-minded place like this, because by and large, most of us here today are, after all, Americans. We were raised with a firm belief in American exceptionalism. We were taught that we live in the greatest nation on earth. We were taught that there is no greater gift than to be a U.S. citizen. And we were taught to believe that we have the best of everything. We were raised to believe that we have the most egalitarian education system and the very best healthcare system. We are the good guys. We bring freedom and democracy wherever we go. We free the enslaved, we educate the illiterate, and we cure the sick. Our military men and women bring justice and comfort wherever they go. We were taught that we are the land of the free and the home of the brave. We watch the Olympics and we get choked up when an American wins and the Star-Spangled Banner is played. We give lip service to our opposition of war and yet nonetheless speak proudly of the war heroes on our family trees. But I'm going to risk drawing a little bit of ire this morning anyway. And I'm going to say that I think, in many ways, we are a uniquely mean nation. This was really brought home to me personally in 2009. Some of you may have heard this story in the past, so forgive me if you have. But Christmas of 2008, my partner, Michael, became gravely ill. He spent a few days in bed with what we thought was just the flu, and he finally ended up in the emergency room at Rochester General. He had severe sepsis and was at risk for organ failure. Now, to make things worse, he was also born with a congenital heart problem, and this infection was damaging his already compromised heart muscle. I was advised to contact his family right away and let them know that at that moment, his odds for survival were about 50-50. They were going to give him massive doses of intravenous antibiotics and hope that that worked. However, the infection and the illness and the heart problem were not the only problems that we had to deal with. His heart was manifesting new problems, and this had them worried. He was placed in ICU immediately, and 2 teams of doctors, the infectious disease team and the cardiology team, oversaw his care. There was 1 nurse assigned to his case full-time for the first 48 hours or so. There were MRIs, there were blood tests, IV medication, and a whole host of other interventions that I could have described to you in detail at the time, but thankfully have faded from my memory over time. His room was a really, really busy place. Now, had we lived virtually anywhere else in the world, his illness and its treatment would have been our only worry. We would have been able to focus solely on his care. But because we live in the United States of America, we had another just as worrisome, and by the way, uniquely American problem to worry about, and I bet you already know what it is. How were we going to pay for all of this care? As a self-employed person, Michael did not have health insurance, and because it was 2008, we were not legally able to be married in New York State, so he couldn't be on my health insurance either. Now, nothing was said about this for about the first 24 hours, as I recall. Although the first days were a blur, I went initially about 60 hours or so without sleep. But eventually, a very nice social worker came to see me, and she gently broached the topic of the lack of health insurance. And she asked me a number of questions about Michael's finances. And when she was done, she seemed relieved. It seemed that he would qualify for emergency Medicaid. But it wouldn't be automatic. I would have to fill out forms and hunt up documentation before it was approved. Now, before I go any further with the story, however, I do want to make one thing very clear. At no point in this whole ordeal did any of the medical practitioners that we talked to even mention health insurance or finances, and at no point did anyone suggest that he would not receive care if he could not pay for it. I have nothing but praise for Rochester General and for the treatment that he received there. However, in spite of that, I knew that we could very likely end up with an astronomical bill that we could never pay if we didn't handle this health insurance issue promptly, and the social worker urged me to take care of it ASAP. So, while my life partner was still in critical condition, I had to leave the hospital and I had to go home and I had to hunt up tax returns, bank statements, business records, and I had to get them, as I recall, going back several years. All because in our uniquely American dog-eat-dog healthcare system, the sick have to fend for themselves no matter how ill they are or no matter how poor they may be. And health insurance, by the way, was not the only added stress that I had. In spite of the fact that Michael was my life partner, we were not legally allowed to be married. And my employment contract as a teacher with Wayne Finger Lakes BOCES stated that I could only miss work to be at the bedside of an immediate family member. And because I was the union president, I have this clause memorized by heart. It says, immediate family is defined as legal spouse, child, grandchild, parent, grandparent, or the equivalent relatives of the teacher's spouse. So in addition to the health insurance issue, I was expected to be at work, a job that's 30 miles away from the hospital, in a setting where we're forbidden to take outside calls during the school day. And at this point, I have to say that I will always appreciate the help and support of our former settled minister, Sally Hamlin. She showed up at the hospital at the perfect time, just as I was dealing with the news that my boss expected me to be at work the next day. Sally, as many of you may recall, had a medical background, and she gave me some wonderful advice that I hadn't thought of. She advised me to go to my own doctor, explain the situation, and have my doctor write me a note taking me out of work under doctor's orders. And while I was grateful for the suggestion, it still meant more time away from the hospital, as I had to go to the doctor when I wasn't sick, and I had to wait a long time because I had been squeezed in at the last minute to his already busy schedule, and then I had to plead my case to the doctor, hoping that he would help me. He did see the predicament I was in, and he did write a note, but I had one last hurdle to jump. I had to go to a Kinko's store to use a fax machine. The school needed me to fill out a form stating that my doctor was taking me out of work, and then I had to complete the form, and I had to fax that form back to them, along with the doctor's note. So between the time I spent collecting all of this documentation for Medicaid and getting a doctor's note because I wasn't allowed to be married, I spent an entire day away from my critically ill spouse. And this should be the end of the story, but it wasn't. The emergency Medicaid did get approved, but keeping this Medicaid in place required constant vigilance. Michael's illness was a really long one, requiring several 2-week hospital stays during the first half of 2009. He had, if anyone knows what it is, a PICC line in his arm full-time, and he was on IV drugs from December to May this whole time. And so because of this, a visiting nurse had to come to our house every single day for over 5 months. And yet, in spite of all this, 3 times during this 6-month period, Monroe County decided that they had been generous enough and they cut off the Medicaid with only a few days' notice. And one time they even cut it off while he was actually in the hospital. On February 26th, a few days after he had been readmitted for congestive heart failure, we received a letter that the Medicaid would be ending on March 1st. I couldn't reach anyone to appeal the decision. Now, while this was going on, the doctors had decided that Michael needed a pacemaker. But the infection in his system was not under control, so they really wanted to wait until the infection was gone because it was quite likely that the pacemaker would get infected and then they would have to take it out. However, they decided to go ahead anyway with putting in the pacemaker and doing it before March 1st because if they didn't, he wouldn't have any health insurance and we'd never be able, the device alone at that time cost over $10,000 and they knew that he wouldn't be able to pay for it out of pocket. Well, their fears turned out to be founded. The pacemaker did become infected and he had to have another surgical procedure to have the pacemaker removed. So think about this. Nowhere else in the world would money and the ability to pay drive a medical decision in this way. And to be clear, the doctors were trying to be kind and generous and put this in while he had insurance. So each time the Medicaid was cut off, I had to seek legal advice, I had to produce more documentation and try to get it reinstated. However, on June 23rd of that year, we got a notice stating that his case was going to be closed on July 1st regardless. This time the decision could not be appealed, and our only recourse would be to start the process all over again and apply for regular Medicaid. And they said the process could take several months. We only had one possible option. Thanks to a court case that some of us might remember, Martinez versus Monroe County, of all places. This court decision had decided a few months earlier on same-sex marriage. So we had an option of going to a state or a nation where same-sex marriage was legal, getting married, and then coming back with the marriage license, and New York State would have to recognize the license. So you couldn't have your wedding in New York, but if you went somewhere where it was legal and came back, the state would have to recognize it. So Michael was still undergoing treatment, and we really needed the health insurance. It was the only solution that I could think of. And it wasn't, by the way, certainly that we didn't want to get married, but it was not legal in this state at the time, and he was really sick. And if we had been able to make our choice, we would have chosen to do it at a time when he wasn't ill, and in a place where our family and friends could be there. So with just like 3 days' notice, we had to essentially elope to Toronto. Nobody from our circle of family or friends could go on such short notice. But fortunately, though, I will say we were surrounded by members of the First Unitarian Congregation of Toronto, people who knew me from my internship. But it would have been much nicer to have been able to plan ahead of time for a wedding in this very sanctuary, surrounded by our family and our friends. So as we drove home from Toronto that day after having been married, and I had to be here, it was a Saturday, and I had to be here the next morning to be in the pulpit, so we couldn't stay over, I had a feeling that I never expected to have. I actually found that I did really feel different. There was something about being legally married and having an actual, real marriage license, just like everybody else has, that made me feel special in a way that I could not possibly have anticipated. And I said to Michael as we sped along the QEW toward the Peace Bridge, well, for the next hour and a half or so while we're in Canada, we really are legally and fully married. But I knew that that would only last until I had to pull up to that little booth and tell a U.S. border agent what my citizenship was. And I knew as soon as I hit the Buffalo side of that bridge, we would be second-class citizens again. As we drove, I thought back on the year that I had spent living in Toronto doing my internship. And my year as kind of an honorary Canadian. And I thought, had Canada been our home, none of the problems that I just laid out for you would have been an issue. Because first and foremost, everyone in Canada has health insurance. No one has to worry about medical bills in the way that we do here. And a person's employment and their marital status does not have any bearing on it. And if medical coverage, even if, by the way, medical coverage had been related to your marital status in Canada, we could have been able to get married right in the ICU by a hospital chaplain because it was legal there. I would not have had to jump through all of those hoops I had to jump through to make myself absent from my job because I could have just been legally married and that clause in the contract would have covered me because he would have been a legal spouse. The whole experience would have been easier and much less stressful had we lived anywhere else in the developed world but the United States of America. Now, I tell this story this morning not for personal catharsis and not to gain your sympathy, by the way. I don't even think that this story is particularly unique or overly terrible compared to many, many stories we have all heard over the years. I am telling it because, sadly, it's a story that I think all Americans, all citizens of the United States can relate to. And I believe that we have all experienced similar struggles. I feel quite certain that nearly every one of us that is here today has had some sort of stressful situation or some sort of complication related to health insurance or the lack thereof. Perhaps high deductibles, perhaps you had a pre-existing condition, perhaps you haven't been able to cover a loved one. We have all had our lives made more complicated and our illnesses made even scarier by this uniquely American problem. I'm sorry to say it, but we really are kind of a mean nation in many ways. And sadly, I think we are kind of unique in this meanness. I've heard it said that you can judge a society by how it treats its most vulnerable citizens. And our record in this area, in my opinion, is abysmal. No one is more vulnerable than the critically ill. And the richest, most powerful nation on earth can do better. Much, much better than we do. If a tiny, impoverished nation like Cuba can provide high-quality, free health care to its citizens, then we can certainly do the same. And health care is not, by the way, the only issue where we fail. It's just the one that I had a personal story to tell about. As I tick off this list, keep in mind, as I say each thing, that again, we are the richest and most powerful nation on earth. And yet, we can't provide safe streets or schools because we can't end our national love affair with guns. We can't pay all of our citizens a living wage because our politicians don't want to allow it, and because there are many, many, many of us who feel that the value of our own work would be somehow diminished if the gap was made smaller between the skilled and the unskilled. We cannot provide quality education equally to all of our children because those of us who can afford to isolate ourselves in enclaves of privilege, and we fight attempts at integration, and we fight attempts to evenly distribute school tax dollars evenly to every student. We can't provide paid family leave so that our citizens can take care of their spouses, parents, or children. We can't provide affordable daycare so that their mothers can work. We can't provide affordable housing so that families don't have to be homeless. We can't provide women with safe access to reproductive health care. We can't ensure equal opportunities for all of our citizens regardless of race, gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, or socioeconomic status. I could go on and on because there are a lot more things that could be on this list. We are, in my opinion, a uniquely mean nation. We stand alone among developed nations in our frontier mentality, our every person for him or herself ethos, our fetishistic attachment to individualism, our mythological belief that strength of character and hard work are the antidote to every possible injustice. There are, to be sure, many nations that perform worse than we do in many of the areas that I mentioned. But without exception, these are all poor, struggling, or war-torn nations in the third world, and we are the richest, most powerful nation on earth. There is no other developed, stable nation on earth that imposes such unnecessary injustice and inequality upon its citizens across such a broad range of basic bread and butter issues. And this leads me back to my point about Donald Trump. We had all of these problems before the election of Donald J. Trump. I will reiterate again for clarity that I am not in any way excusing, exonerating, or normalizing his behavior, or any of his policies. I am not in any way speaking as a defender or an apologist for him. I am simply saying what I said at the beginning, that in my opinion, he is a symptom of a much larger and much more fundamentally broken culture than many of us are aware of. Think about this. In a well-functioning, just, egalitarian, and compassionate society, he would have been booed off the stage at his very first rally and never heard from again. And the fact that he rose to the top as quickly as he did should scare and concern us way more than anything that he personally could do or say. I'm wondering if perhaps the biggest threat that he poses is the distraction that he creates. Because when we are all focused on him, we are not discussing the issues. We are not seeking real solutions, and to some extent, we're abdicating and denying our own culpability and privilege. It's way too easy to simply blame him and then be done with it, as many of my friends now do. Kind of a one-stop shopping approach to all that is wrong in the world. Just blame it on Donald Trump. It may provide a bit of temporary catharsis, but it doesn't solve the problem. And it doesn't address the root cause. We were a mean nation long before 2016, and we will continue to be a mean one long after this unless we focus on the real root causes of how we got to where we are today. So it's been a long time since I've broken the rule that I was taught in seminary. Remember the one, you should never refer to the sermon in a sermon. You shouldn't use the word sermon in a sermon. But I'm going to do that today. Because I was telling a friend about what I planned to say this morning, wondering, gee, am I really just preaching to the converted? And my friend, who is very intelligent, very well educated, and very liberal, was immediately dismissive before I even had the description out of my mouth. Oh, she said, so you don't think we should criticize Trump? And she was clearly irritated when she asked me this. Let me guess, she said, your message is going to be that we should just endure him. Either that, or you're going to get up and say that we should love the sinner and hate the sin. Are you going to insist that we just overlook his faults? Well, she wasn't really listening, but I said anyway, neither, I told her. I'm going to say this. I'm going to say that our nation was on the wrong path a long time before he was elected. And I believe that he is a symptom of our problems more than he is the cause. And I'm going to point out that in many ways, we were a mean-spirited nation long before he came along, and I'm going to ask, why does meanness win elections? Well, she replied, meanness wins elections for Republicans. Democrats win elections by being fair and compassionate. If you really want to address the problem, you'll simply need to tell your congregation that if they don't want meanness, they should elect a Democrat the next time, and that will fix things. So the problem is obvious. Too much focus on Donald Trump obscures the issues. It provides absolution for everyone else. It helps to reinforce the sense of us and them, good and bad. There are good guys, there are bad guys. We're right, they're wrong. And I would like to point out at this point that Democrats have won their share of elections through meanness as well. Bill Clinton largely succeeded because he was willing to be mean. His tough-on-crime legislation with its 3 strikes and you're out provision, mandatory minimum sentences, and the truth in sentencing provision, which was actually a euphemism for no more parole, led to mass incarcerations of thousands and thousands of mostly minority people for very low-level, non-violent crimes. Democratic voters were happy with that. They re-elected him. They made him their nominee the second time. It made a lot of them feel good to see those bad people really get what they had coming. Clinton's welfare reform bill punished and demonized the poor. Just look at what it was called. I had forgotten this till I looked it up, but it was called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. So in other words, those lazy welfare queens, remember those people that we didn't know existed until Ronald Reagan described them for us? Well, those people were finally going to have to step up and take some responsibility for supporting themselves. But, by the way, no worries, because at the same time, they're going to be given opportunities to work. This legislation actually meant that no more actual money was given to destitute people. So people still get some food stamps and they still get help with rent, but there is no such thing pretty much under welfare reform as getting any actual money in your pocket to buy shoes for your child or have any discretionary spending at all. It was a mean-spirited attack on our nation's most vulnerable people. And by the way, it also demonized them and blamed their poverty on their own moral failure. I mean, think about it. It's all right in the title. But America enjoyed that too. I have to work hard. Why shouldn't they as well, was the attitude. And it felt good for a lot of people to see these layabouts finally held accountable. And it was being done by a Democrat, so it must be okay. Another friend Governor Andrew Cuomo, champion of same-sex marriage. But if you recall, he also made demonizing public school teachers and punishing poor and disabled children the #1 priority of his first term. He tried to sell New Yorkers on the idea that for far too long, these lazy teachers had had a free and easy ride at the expense of the taxpayer who actually did real work. His solution to all these problems was to try to bust teacher unions, end the pension system as we know it, and force thousands of disabled children to sit through hours and hours of grueling, psychologically damaging tests for the purpose of demonstrating to the state just how bad their teachers were. I knew many, many, many liberal Democrats who applauded these policies and enjoyed seeing teachers finally being punished for having such an easy ride. We are, in many ways, a mean nation. And in many ways, this meanness is embedded in our DNA. And we are all paying the price, and we are all responsible for trying to fix it. If we want to be part of the solution, we need to take our focus off a symptom, which is Donald Trump, and keep it focused on the cause. So I would like to ask each and every one of us here this morning to covenant together to live our Unitarian Universalist principles of justice, equity, and compassion in all human relations, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. We will accomplish far more by embodying these principles than we ever will by focusing all of our attention on one mean man.